Our next presenter is Dr. Tracey MacKenzie, who's just turned his camera on there. So Tracey's a professor at Dalhousie's Department of Plant, Food and Environmental Sciences in Truro, and he's interested in trees, landscape planning, and biodiversity, which is fitting, and a good segue from our first presentation, because that's what he's here to talk about tonight, is why we need to protect biodiversity and why we should care about all of this. So welcome, Tracey, and take it away.
Thanks very much, Becky. Good evening, everyone. And thank you, Karen, for that wonderful presentation. I could easily give up my presentation time to listen to you talk. It was very informative, and thanks for that. It's a real pleasure for me to be here this evening to talk to members of Nature Nova Scotia. I've spent a bit of time this weekend listening to some of your talks, and been through your website in the last few weeks, and looked at some of your efforts. It's very inspiring, wonderful work. And so hopefully I can add some information to that and perhaps encourage some dialogue towards your good deeds and working towards the future. So I'm just going to share my screen with everybody here. And hopefully this will work. Can everybody see my screen now?
Yep.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, so a shout out to whoever made my introductory slide. It's kind of embarrassing that I didn't make it myself, but whoever did make this, perhaps Leslie, who's in the call, could give an indication who made this, but they picked out some photos related to what I do quite well, actually. One of the photos here is a picture taken of me beside a giant redwood in Sequoia National Park in California. Very interesting time. I've had the good fortune of visiting there a few times. And the other interesting photo there you see is the basidiocarps on the log. I just did a little exercise or a little experiment at my property in the Wentworth Valley last year, actually, where I took a habitat log, and it was getting to the point of being a bit hazardous, but I didn't want to lose it. So I knocked it to the ground, and it was very fascinating to see how quickly the basidiocarps formed and the orientation that they formed in the landscape. So I thought that was really interesting that somebody put those into the slides. When we talk about the redwoods, as I mentioned, I've had the good fortune to visit redwood parks in California and habitats several times. And I think we all realize that these areas have been under severe environmental stress. This particular park here, Big Basin State Park in California, was influenced by fire in 2020. You can see a picture there. It's really a humbling thing when you stand inside of the tree. And the tree next to it, as you can see, that was influenced by that fire, the size of that tree and the cavity that you can get into would easily support probably a 6-man or a 6-person tent and be a wonderful place to camp overnight. And fortunately, Big Basin Park is reopening this year, and they're looking at reimagining the status of the park and how it will function in the future. I think when you think about California, of course, they're reimagining the landscapes in many different ways, given the environmental stresses that they're experiencing. The case of the redwoods has always been fascinating for me, and it's certainly been a struggle to come to the realization of the importance of this particular species in the state of California, and if not the Pacific Coast. And it's unfortunate that such a small percentage of the millions of acres that were once there remain. The park that I visited was very low down on this particular map, the Big Basin Park, but I also visited parks in the Sierra Nevadas as well. One might look back at that point in history and think about the naivety of the people that were involved. Perhaps somebody might look back at us someday and think about our own naivety in terms of how we've handled the environment and our environmental perspective. It's not until huge ecosystem losses have occurred that we realize the need for sustainable forestry practices. And once a keystone species has been damaged we start to realize the impacts. And then we're left with the challenge of trying to restore what is left. And there's been discussions and arguments about the redwoods and whether they really represent a keystone species and you know what their impact is on the ecosystem. And if you spend any time on the West Coast, you'd realize the really interesting environment that exists there. And when you think about the moisture coming off of the Pacific, and this is actually not in California, these are photos that I took while I was exploring the woods in Oregon. And when you see the fog banks coming off the Pacific and they hit the land, and of course with the warming air, and they rise up into the forest, it's really an amazing thing to take part in and to see process. And the process that you see here is one of capturing moisture that feeds the ecosystem. So these coastal redwoods, and in this particular case, they're not coastal redwoods, they're coastal spruce, Sitka spruce. They capture this moisture and they serve as a keystone species to provide moisture for the entire ecosystem. Just to give you a sense of scale, in this particular photo, you can see a friend of mine here at the bottom of this Sitka spruce. So we're looking at some pretty good sized timber here, some nice old growth forests. And you might say, well, why is he talking about this? Why is he talking about the Pacific coast? And well, we have this too. And I'm here tonight to talk and support about the Wentworth Valley ecosystem and support the Protect Wentworth Valley initiative. And this is a photo that I took from the top of the ski hill, actually, where you can see moisture-laden air from the Bay of Fundy intersecting the cold air from the north in this high pressure zone. So you can see this very narrow band here of moisture-laden clouds. So when I took this picture, it was beautiful and sunny. Less than 15 minutes later, it was snowing to beat the band. And it's a wonderful thing to see this type of microclimate activity occur. And whenever we're, of course, in an area where we have coastal conditions, lots of moisture being pushed inwards, inlandwards by tides, meeting cold air, experiencing elevational change, we're going to have things like that occur. So it's really interesting to see the influence of not only climate, but also vegetation and landform. We have old growth forests too in Nova Scotia, but not necessarily that much. So if anybody has read the Nova Scotia Old Growth Forest Report, you understand what an old growth forest is in terms of trees that are greater than 125 years old, and where we ideally should have 30% or more of the species in a particular stand representing trees of that age. In Nova Scotia, really what we're talking about is late successional or climax species. One of the things that I indicated here, and if you think about the forests, for example, in the Wentworth Valley, we have a lot of tolerant hardwood stands, and we'd like to think that we have late successional species there, particular sugar maple. We also have American beech, but you notice that I've highlighted the American beech, and I'm sure many of you realize that the American beech unfortunately has been a victim of colonization, and the large beech trees as a late successional species have certainly lost their grandeur in the last 300 years as a result of the scale and disease complex called beech bark disease. So just imagine for a moment if that wasn't introduced to Nova Scotia in the late 1800s, what our forests might look like now. And for example, what the forests in the Wentworth Valley might look like if not for that anthropogenic influence. So indeed, we're at a state in Nova Scotia where we don't have a lot of old growth forests, but we do have hope. So there's a few pictures on this slide here. Two of them are from Oregon, and where I had the great opportunity to visit some old growth forests, and you'll see my friend and I standing beside a large Sitka spruce, one of the largest on the West Coast. And when you're standing in an old growth forest, you certainly realize it very quick. The sense of scale and the biodiversity becomes very evident to you. And we're fortunate to have old growth forests in Nova Scotia. Interesting in the news not too long ago about the 532-year-old eastern hemlock near Hubbards. Great find. I hope nobody finds out where it is, because that's one of the biggest problems is when you tell somebody where a big tree is, just like the Sitka spruce, people go looking for it, and we certainly don't want to damage that ecosystem. But we have great potential in Nova Scotia for climax forests. When we think about, in particular, the Wentworth Valley area and the hardwood forests that exist there, you'll notice in this slide at the top that there are some older forests that give them a few more years, and we might have some well, quite a few more years, and we might have some old growth there as well. So when we think about the state of Nova Scotia forests, and Karen alluded to this in her presentation, we're very fortunate. We have 75% forest coverage. Of course, a lot of that is privately owned, and those things have been discussed in the State of the Forest Policy or review for Nova Scotia, and also the Leahy report. It's a big challenge when we think about ecosystem-based management to forest management as it transitions to ecological forestry, as encouraged by the Leahy report. We do a very good job in Nova Scotia about talking about ecological principles and applying them to forestry. It seems to be a little harder to get everybody to buy into this. And I know some of the challenges that have been expressed on the Nature Nova Scotia site reflect some of the issues that we experience with this. Our Acadian forest certainly has tremendous biological capacity, and it's really important that we protect this for a sustainable future. Unfortunately, our history of forest exploitation over the last 350 years isn't so favorable, and it's resulted in a resource that really is less diverse and more vulnerable than ever. For those of you who are not familiar, the borealization of our Acadian forest is a real issue. And if you're interested in learning more about that, there's a number of different sources online and opportunities to learn more about what borealization is. We've lost diversity as a result of forestry activities. Forestry practices favor cold weather tolerant species. Even our balsam fir, it's really susceptible to some of the implications of climate change. And a lot of our forestry practices have encouraged forest structure that may not fare so well if our climate continues to change. The government has made some big promises to us. In July 2021, they talked about reaching 80% renewable energy by 2030. They also talked about increasing land and water mass protection to 20%. These are both admirable goals. And who would have ever thought that they would in some ways conflict with each other? It is important as a government moving forward that we ensure a sustainable future. But what happens when one sustainable goal goes against another? And by no means am I against renewable energy, but the insidious nature of wind power, it comes in to potentially cause irreparable damage to ecosystems. And one of the things that the group in Wentworth is most concerned about is losing this ecosystem, destroying habitat, and the implications that it's going to have on not only our environment, but also our community. I wrote a letter in support of the Protect Wentworth Valley Society, a few months ago to the Cumberland Planning County or Commission, and I made reference to some quotes by Linton Caldwell. Any of you that are familiar with environmental studies, environmental thought, environmental thinking and policy would know who Linton Caldwell is. He's not an environmentalist, by the way, for those of you who don't know, he is actually a political scientist. And one of the things that Linton Caldwell made reference to is public decision-making and how it makes an effort to discuss the two not necessarily opposite, but definitely dissimilar viewpoints of economy and ecology, and how it's important to realize that our world relies on the environment. And when making decisions, it's important that we consider those things. I also want to share with you this quote from Linton Caldwell that I share with every one of my classes when I talk about environmental efforts and sustainability, and more particularly the environmental crisis, and how he describes it as an outward manifestation of a crisis of mind and spirit. There could be no greater misconception of its meaning than to believe it is to be concerned with only endangered wildlife, human-made ugliness and pollution. These things are part of it, but more importantly, the crisis is concerned with the kind of creatures that we are and what we must become in order to survive. We see things like this all the time, making reference to sustainability. And unfortunately, sustainability is becoming, or has become, a very politicized term. And I picked the most stylized graphic I could find online to share with you. And when we think about sustainability in this term, it gives the environment a bit of a second-class standing. And it's not fair to suggest that the environment is equally important to economics and society. Without the environment, we wouldn't have society and there would be no need for economics. When we think about sustainability in this way, we're making a mistake. It's making the struggle real for us. And so for all of us who value nature, who understand the importance of nature, it's a real challenge for us to overcome this type of thinking. We know that there are many different ways of looking at this. If we think about the economy as a construct of society that exists because of our environment, we tend to look at things a bit differently. Even if we look to the federal government and try to understand exactly what sustainable development is, they talk the talk very well, but sometimes that talk doesn't result in action. And I just want to point out a few key things, and I know there's a lot of text on this slide, but remember that sustainable development deals with the protection of ecosystems. It focuses on the precautionary principle. So the idea of putting a 600-foot windmill within an ecosystem in the Wentworth Valley that has never been placed in any land surface in all of North America does not follow the precautionary principle. When we think about sustainable development and the concept of intergenerational equity, openness and transparency, the involvement and inclusion of Aboriginal peoples, collaboration, and a results in delivery approach, I think we all realize that we fall short of those things in many of our efforts to improve our economy. Sustainable development is very important to our world. The United Nations has come up with these 17 sustainable development goals. So what happens when two of these goals conflict with each other? So if we think about goal number 7, affordable and clean energy, what's the implication of affordable and clean energy to life on land, goal number 15? So Nova Scotia Power has made a commitment towards sustainable and modern energy. It's suggested that they've made great headway and they have great plans for the future, and it's being supported by government. If we look at the Canadian Energy Regulator and actually see how things have changed for us in Nova Scotia, one of the big suggestions is that we're going to get rid of coal. Now, I don't know what you see in this particular graph, but I know one of the things that I see, and I don't see a lot of change in coal. I see definitely an increase in renewables, and we know we have to get there. But I also see an increase in energy demand. And sustainability really starts with conservation. And that's something we certainly have to focus on. Absolutely, we have to get rid of fossil fuels. We have to support renewables, but there is a right and a wrong way to go about this. So when we think about life on land, we think about protecting, restoring, and promoting sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems. Well, how much do we actually put these policies into practice? And how much control do we have over it? It's very difficult when we have 70% forest ownership in Nova Scotia in private parcels. It's, and one of the frustrations with the Leahy report, for example, is how do we encourage ecological forestry and 70% of the forests in Nova Scotia? So if we think about what an ecosystem is, as an assemblage of organisms living together as a biotic community, how do we work with this more successfully? It's more complicated than we might think. And the use of that word complications, and the reason I put this particular graphic of a watch, is anything that goes beyond the telling of time or the display of time on a watch is referred to as a complication. And watches have become very, very complicated, and people celebrate the amount of human ingenuity that goes into understanding the workings of these machines, if you will, how these parts work together and interact. Well, if you think about this in the context of an ecosystem is much more complex mechanism than what we're looking at in this picture. We're dealing with living things. We're dealing with open boundaries. We're dealing with responses to disturbances and change over time. It's a very different scenario. So what does the government of Canada think about biodiversity and the importance of biodiversity? It's interesting when you look to government for guidance that they talk about biodiversity consisting of the life forms we experience all around it, yet remarkably know little about. So where does that leave us in terms of making policy? Maybe we have to look towards another important source of information in education. I have a little slideshow or a little video to show you here. Let's hope that it works for you. Let's see, just one moment. Maybe it's not going to work for me. I think I'll skip over that. If anybody would like to look at that video on your own time, it's a short video from David Suzuki talking about the importance of biodiversity and ecosystems. I'll put a link up for that later. In my classes, I teach one class called Environmental Processes and Natural Landscape Functions. And I give this question to my students on a midterm exam. And essentially, what I ask them to do is explain this particular pyramid structure. And essentially what it refers to is biodiversity is the underlying foundation of the structure of any ecosystem. Ecosystem structure is the underlying foundation for function, and ecosystem function is what ensures ecosystem services. So when we think about biodiversity or diversity, we realize it occurs in many different levels or scales within a landscape. Many of you are very familiar with that. And if we think about the diversity process in terms of adaptation and speciation, it's an amazing thing that takes many years, millions of years to form. But this picture of the forest, this hardwood tolerant stand in Wentworth Valley, how long do you think it's been like this? And the truth is that this forest stand and these types of conditions have only been like this within the last 100 years or more. And there is one species that used to have a very large impact on this forest stand that doesn't have near as much impact now at all. And that's the beech tree that I told you about earlier. So we still have beech trees in this ecosystem, but they've been severely influenced by anthropogenic stressors when we talk about the beech bark disease. So this ecosystem, one could suggest that it's been a product of millions of years of speciation, but it's been irreparably damaged by anthropogenic stress. So why is diversity important to us? From a very anthropocentric point of view, some of the species that we see in nature may have economic, medical, aesthetic, recreational, scientific, or ecological value at some point. On the lower part of this slide, I show you a picture of Taxus canadensis adjacent to Folly Lake. The Taxus canadensis is actually in the back here. Let me just turn on the Taxus canadensis is right there. I'm sure some of you have probably seen Taxus canadensis on some of your hikes and can identify Taxus canadensis. And some of you probably also know that it has great potential as a cancer cure, Taxol. It's also a very poisonous plant, by the way. Many parts of Taxus are poisonous, including the stems and the leaves, but it has great medicinal potential. If we think about the value of diversity from an Earth first point of view, each species that exists within our ecosystems is a product of millions of years of adaptation and plays a role in that ecological system that I made reference to. A diverse landscape or an ecosystem is more adaptable to change and more adaptable to disturbances, more resilient, if you will. So if we reflect back on the hardwood forest of Wentworth once again, the reason those forests continue to be successful, even though anthropogenic stress has resulted in decline of one of their key species. The diversity of that ecosystem has allowed it to continue to be successful. I too am a product of the School of Resource and Environmental Studies at Dalhousie University. I did my master's there in, I forget, early 2000s, I suspect. I did some work on Hemlock Ravine Park down adjacent to the Bedford Basin. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this particular area. And this is an overhead view of the park in its early years. I think this is from probably early 2001. And you'll notice the development just to the north of Hemlock Ravine Park. So here's Hemlock Ravine Park. I'm sure many of you have walked there before. And this, I believe, is Starboard Drive. And one of the things that I worked on is determining the change that happened around the park using GIS assessment and what the resulting impact would be on environmental services. So obviously development having an influence on landscape structure, therefore influencing landscape function and process, and having a negative impact on environmental services. So the landscape as a result responds not only to those changes, but the ability for that landscape to respond to future disturbances. Now we all know what happened in the Bedford Basin. The forests that exist in this part is now all but gone, and has jumped over the development, has jumped over the Bicentennial Highway. And as Karen mentioned in her presentation, that development pressure extends towards Hubbards and other very important areas within the province. So it's a big challenge for us to understand and to communicate the impacts of development and the impacts of construction on these critical systems or critical ecosystems and the services that they provide. One of the things that I focused my master's research on was the hydrological impact of this development in this area. And not only does it have impact on base flow in terms of water in the ecosystem, but the response to stormwater. As a result of development in and around Hemlock Ravine Park, the amount of water that now flows into Bedford Basin is in the billions of gallons in comparison to pre-development scenarios. And so the real risk of flooding, stormwater issues has definitely become an issue for the Bedford Basin. So when we think about ecosystem and ecosystem health, obviously landscape structure and function are very core concepts involved here. So ecological health is a function of ecosystem structure and ecosystem function. And all of these things influence ecosystem services, the things that not only we rely on, but all organisms rely on. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment explained ecosystem services very well, talking about supporting, provisioning, regulating cultural services. And it tied them to, in a very anthropocentric way, human health and well-being. But supporting services are not necessarily only important to humans, they're important to the ecosystem itself in terms of nutrient cycling, soil formation, and primary production. And of course, the species that live there in terms of food, fresh water, for example, and the regulating effects as well. So the importance of these ecosystems and the services that they provide are numerous. But the threats to these ecosystems are also numerous. When we think about habitat loss, exploitation, pollution, invasive species, and climate change, all of these things have an influence on biodiversity and ecosystem change. And when we see that change in structure, we see the change in function, and we see a change in service, which results in social economic change. So biodiversity becomes very important to us. Here's a very interesting quote from Dr. Edward Wilson, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with him. The worst thing that can happen is not energy depletion, economic collapse, limited nuclear war, or conquest by a totalitarian government. As terrible as these catastrophic things would be for us, they can be repaired within a few generations, the one process ongoing that will take millions of years to correct is the loss of genetic and species diversity by the destruction of natural habitats. Just to give an idea of our dominance and the influence that we've had as a species on this world, if we think about the biomass of all organisms, I want you to focus your attention on this particular graph over here in terms of the biomass of wild mammals in comparison to humans and human-dominated livestock. Putting it another way, if we look at change over the last even 100 years, 120 years, it's amazing to see the difference, the influence that we've had on the biomass of wildlife, and of course, the dominance of human species and human-supported species. There are, however, criteria for good ecosystem-based planning and development. Understanding the ecosystem in the site, protecting ecological integrity, creating new habitats, and encouraging natural regeneration, conserving landforms, preserving and enhancing groundwater sources, and promoting environmental education and interpretation is very important and something that we must encourage. It's very important that we understand the existing ecosystem, and the government of Nova Scotia has done a great job in providing tremendous information that's available to all of us. For example, this document here on this slide, the Ecological Landscape Analysis for the Cobequid Hills Eco District, does a wonderful job at explaining the ecological structure of the Cobequid Hills and more specifically the Wentworth Valley ecosystem. Understanding landforms, geology, vegetative structures is crucial to making good decisions. Using an ecological landscape classification system becomes an important tool required for managing and promoting sustainable landscapes. We need to protect ecological integrity. And when we think about wind farms, for example, in the Wentworth Valley, and we think about wind farms in the Cobequid Hills, we have to wonder if they're really applying the precautionary principle and thinking about these things appropriately. Are they really considering habitats and regeneration? Are they trying to conserve landforms in significant natural areas? Have they identified sensitive areas? Are they trying to retain natural character, structure, and function, and services? Are they preserving and enhancing groundwater? And are they promoting environmental awareness? So in closing, I want to draw your attention to something that many of you may have seen before. And if you haven't seen this video, I encourage you to look it up online, called the pale blue dot. And if you're a product of the 70s and 80s like I am, you'll remember Carl Sagan and his show called The Cosmos, and how he reflects on the planet that we live on as the pale blue dot. And it really is a miracle. We're floating around the cosmos on a miracle. We've all been given this privilege. Why don't we take care of it? Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Tracey. Ron has a comment here that I really like, because I'm often the one that deals with a lot of our social media comments, and he's just saying that the forestry industry in Nova Scotia so often says things like, Nova Scotia is 75% covered in trees, what's the big deal? And Ron's pointing out that, of course, as you've said, that's not necessarily well-functioning forests. So I guess he's just wondering if you have any comments on those tactics.
A document that I actually asked my students to read was written by Gary Saunders. Some of you may know Gary Saunders, very a well-known forester in Nova Scotia. He wrote a book called The Trees of Nova Scotia as well. And his particular essay talks about declining forest productivity and declining biodiversity in forests, and making reference to forest policy and procedures. And as you mentioned in the question, what type of forest are we dealing with now? Well, when we think about the Acadian forest and the species and the diversity that once existed, our forests have most definitely become borealized, favoring certain species. And the level of diversity, the age classification have all been victimized by unsustainable forestry practices. There's a lot we can do, but as bad as that sounds, there's tremendous potential in our forest in terms of biocapacity, and all is not lost. The fact that we have 75% forest coverage or pseudo forest coverage offers hope for the future, and that if these forests are managed effectively, we can improve biodiversity and we can improve forest health. But the only way to do that is to improve education and buy-in from private landowners.
Good change happening now. All right. Well, thank you so much. Well, feel free to stick any more questions, comments in the chat there, folks. I did see, I think it was Ron posted the link that you mentioned, Tracey. So we have that there as well.
Thank you very much.